what took place in Moscow, the mall shooting. I think we're now at maybe 143 people died, just terrible situation, but a lot swirling around this terrorist attack. And we are very, very honored to be joined, excuse me, by our very own world famous Kay Pritzker. Well, Kay, we appreciate you coming through to help us sort through this. Obviously, there's so much swirling around what took place in Moscow, and of course, I think the big question that people are having is, who did it? Obviously, ISIS or allegedly ISIS-K in Afghanistan has claimed credit for it. The Russian government is saying that Ukraine is behind it. There's debate about maybe they were even working together on some people. So there's all this sort of swirling thing. I guess I just wonder, really, what do you think about this debate in and of itself around the who done it when we don't really know exactly what's going on yet?
Yeah, I mean, this whole debate is almost misframed, especially on the U.S.'s side, because they're saying ISIS was just the sole one involved or the sole group involved. But regardless of who pulled the trigger, I mean, I think any discussion of this topic has to start with where ISIS actually comes from, and that's from the United States. ISIS came out of the power vacuum that was created after the U.S. invaded Iraq, destroyed its government, destabilized the country, and demobilized the Ba'athist government and the Iraqi army, which left a bunch of people out on the street with guns and no jobs. And of course, they went and formed groups like Al Qaeda in Iraq and then eventually ISIS. You talk about where ISIS K comes from, the ISIS affiliate in Afghanistan that's accused of orchestrating this attack. I mean, they came out of the power vacuum that was created when the US invaded Afghanistan and, tried to put all of these puppet governments in power and failed, and eventually handed the government over to the Taliban, which created an environment where these sort of Wahhabist Islamic fundamentalist groups could sort of thrive in. So, from that angle, I mean, the US can't really escape this. And moreover, I mean, the US really, Wahhabism and Islamic fundamentalism is in and of itself sort of a US creation. I mean, it was not only the US that funded and armed the Taliban, that, trained and supported Osama bin Laden when he was fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan, but they also forged this relationship with Saudi Arabia and was really behind Saudi Arabia's diplomatic pivot to exporting Wahhabist ideology. They went to Saudi Arabia and they said, your enemy it's not Israel, it's not the West, it's not imperialism. Your enemy is communism. Your enemy is, the sort of atheistic Soviet Union. And they started flooding the world with Wahhabist textbooks, building Wahhabist schools in Pakistan, throughout the Islamic world, with a lot of the money that they got through this oil deal they struck with the US. So, even from an ideological perspective, the spread of Islamic terrorism or radical Islam Wahhabist ideology is in and of itself a U.S. Creation. And then you talk about the spread of ISIS. I mean, what is ISIS doing in Afghanistan? What is ISIS doing in Tajikistan, where these terrorists that carried out the attack were based out of? I mean, the U.S. then launched wars in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, in Somalia, and created more power vacuums for ISIS to spread all around the world outside of just the Levant. They've now spread to West Africa. They've spread to the Arabian Peninsula. They've spread to South Asia. I've even heard there's ISIS in the Philippines. So the United States and U.S. foreign policy is behind the spread of ISIS, of these terrorist groups, this ideology behind these terrorist groups. So to just say, oh, well, ISIS, they're the ones that planned the attack. I mean, who created ISIS to begin with? And, who created all these contradictions and all this tension surrounding Russia right now, that was obviously very likely linked to this attack.
Well, I'm a little bit confused about this particular branch of ISIS in the sense that like every country it hates happens to be an American adversary or a country. I mean, it is weird, right? Like it's just super weird. So this particular branch of ISIS like hates Iran. Doesn't like it does attacks in Afghanistan and hates Russia. And my question is this like an ally of the US? Like, I don't know where else your mind's supposed to go from that. But also, I mean, importantly, the Russians themselves, like the Russian government, is claiming some sort of Ukrainian involvement. So what are your thoughts on that, Kay? Is it plausible there was some Ukrainian involvement? I think at some point some Ukrainian official tried to suggest that this was some Russian false flag to try to make Ukraine look bad. And I'm like, all right, now everyone's just accusing everyone of stuff. So yeah, explain all this to me because I don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think to start off, the fact that the U.S. came out and said like a few hours after the attack that ISIS is the sole responsible party, that there's no signs of Ukrainian involvement. I mean, this is before Russia had even detained the suspects. This is before they gave their confessions. This is before they appeared in court. The U.S. somehow already knew that Ukraine wasn't involved, and it's like, how did they know that? It's almost like they just threw out their narrative on this, and they said, okay, we'll make the facts align after the fact. But is it so preposterous? I mean, this is what the U.S. keeps saying, that it's ridiculous for Russia to suggest that there's Ukrainian involvement. And I mean, it's preposterous to say that Ukraine might have had a hand in this. I mean, Ukraine has been at war with Russia for the last 2 years. Of course they have, it's not like they don't have some incentive to see an attack like this happen. But I think also when you look at the rhetoric that's been coming from Ukrainian leader, not just the Ukrainian leadership, but also U.S. leadership, calling Russia, a terrorist state, saying they're monsters, they're barbarians, they have to be stopped at all costs. When you hear things like this coming out of the leadership of not just your own country, but of this military superpower that's backing you, is it so preposterous to believe that Ukrainians or someone that sympathized with Ukraine might have heard this and had taken this literally? I mean, if you're talking about a terrorist state, I mean, why would you could see how someone might feel like, oh, I need to take this into my own hands. But moreover, on the socialist program, Brian raised a very interesting quote from Mark Milley, who's one of the top generals in the U.S. military. And he said about 3 months ago, addressing Ukrainian forces, I have the quote here. He said, "There should be no Russian who goes to sleep without wondering if they're going to get their throat slit in the middle of the night. You got to get back there and create a campaign behind enemy lines." So right there, you basically have marching orders, like straight up marching orders, calling for a military campaign behind Russia's lines, so within Russia, to slit their throats, to make Russians fear to go to sleep every night, fearing that their throats will be slit. How are we actually supposed to believe that it's preposterous that Ukraine had no hand in this when you literally have Ukrainian military and also U.S. military officials literally calling for a covert campaign behind behind Russian lines? But I think what takes the cake, I think the most damning piece of all of this is that Ukraine has been involved in attacks like this before. They were involved in the Samara railway bombing, which happened inside Russia. It was a railway that was transporting ammunition to the Russian front lines. It was bombed, and a few hours after the attack, Ukraine posts photos bragging about how it's paralyzed Russia's supply lines, how it's paralyzed all this ammo is being held up. You have the Darya Dugin assassination, which, Darya Dugin was the daughter of a very sort of esteemed Russian political philosopher. She was assassinated in Russia, and there aren't many Russian people who would have wanted this to happen or who would have sort of carried this out. But there were a lot of Ukrainians that celebrated it and were happy about the fact that she was killed. And then you have the Crimean bridge bombing, which Ukraine claimed responsibility for. They claimed responsibility for blowing up a bridge within Russia. So the fact that we're being told that it's preposterous, that we're supposed to feel crazy to even think that there might have been involvement from Ukraine, which has carried out terrorist attacks like this inside Russia before, is ridiculous. And I think the U.S. government, the State Department, wants us to feel crazy. They want people who are skeptical to feel crazy. They want Russia's narrative to sound crazy, but really, I think calling it preposterous to say, to say that there's no chance that Ukraine had any involvement before the facts of the matter have even come out. I think that's really what's preposterous.